Mark stood at the edge of a dirt road, the last sign of pavement long behind him when the old Whittaker house came into view. The homestead was weathered, its boards warped from years of Appalachian sun and rain, yet it stood with a stubborn endurance like a relic refusing to vanish. Weeds pressed in along the property's borders, and the woods seemed to lean closer with every step, as if the land itself guarded the family within. To many in the region, the Whitakers were no more than whispers, an elusive family who rarely ventured beyond their own threshold. But to Mark, they were a story waiting to be told, and this visit marked the beginning of an unsettling, unforgettable journey. The silence of the place was profound. No hum of traffic, no distant chatter of neighbors, only the sound of his own footsteps crunching against gravel. The air felt heavy, thick with both history and secrecy. Windows looked out like watchful eyes, though no one appeared at first glance. The aura surrounding the home wasn't one of menace, but of otherness, a life lived so far removed from the everyday rhythms of modern society that stepping onto the porch felt like entering another world. Mark had been told stories before coming. Here, tales of a family that had lived for generations in isolation, bound together by ties too close for outsiders to understand. Locals spoke of them with unease, sometimes pity, sometimes disdain. But standing there now, what struck him most wasn't the rumors, it was the palpable stillness of the place. It was as though time had stalled here, pausing to preserve a way of life that elsewhere had long since faded. Inside the house, he would soon meet them. Faces that carried the weight of inheritance, eyes that spoke of lives shielded from the outside world. Yet in that first moment, before any words were exchanged, the Whittaker homestead itself told the beginning of their story. It was a house that bore scars, that breathed secrecy, and that carried in its silence the history of a family who had lived for too long in the shadows. Inside the Whittaker home, the air was dim and cool, as if the thick wooden walls had absorbed generations of silence. Mark noticed immediately that daily life here followed no rhythm familiar to the outside world. The furniture was sparse and worn, arranged less for comfort than for necessity. A battered sofa leaned against the wall, a small table crowded with odds and ends, and the faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. It was a home not built for show, but for enduring the slow march of days. The family moved with a rhythm of their own. Communication was often unspoken, gestures replacing words, expressions carrying weight where voices did not. Some would mumble short replies, others gave little more than nods or glances. Yet in those gestures, Mark sensed an unbreakable bond. They had built a world that needed no outsiders, one where understanding was carried in silence. For those accustomed to constant noise and chatter, this quiet could feel unsettling. But to the Whitakers, it was simply life. Their daily routines reflected the rugged isolation of the Appalachian hills. The men would often step outside, wandering toward the woods or tending to small tasks around the property. Old habits of chopping wood, repairing tools, or pacing the yard gave shape to their days. The women kept the home intact in quiet persistence. Every movement seemed born of routine, unremarkable to them, but striking to an observer. Mark quickly noticed the distance between the Whitakers and the surrounding community. Though neighbors knew of them, few had ever come close. Some locals kept their distance out of discomfort, others out of respect for privacy. Rumors filled the gaps where first-hand knowledge failed. In that gap, myths grew larger than reality. And yet, within the house, Mark found not the monstrous figures of whispered stories, but human beings, living in a reality shaped by circumstance, cut off from the larger flow of society. What unsettled him most wasn't what was said. Conversations trailed into silence. Questions met with shrugs, and yet, through that silence, there was an unspoken resilience, a way of surviving in a world that had long since left them behind. For the Whitakers, the edge of community was not exile, but a way of being. As Mark delved deeper into the Whitakers' world, he began to trace the origins of their story. Generations of kinship had anchored the family to this hollow in West Virginia, their roots winding back through the hills like the tangled roots of ancient oaks. In communities where isolation was the rule rather than the exception, families often drew close together. For the Whitakers, that closeness became their defining trait, a legacy carried forward across decades. Local genealogies hinted at patterns of interwoven bloodlines. In the Appalachian backcountry, where travel was difficult and communities remained insular, marriages within extended families were not unheard of. In the case of the Whitakers, it seemed to have become a consistent thread in their history. Whispers of this ancestry circulated among locals, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes spoken with unease. For outsiders, it became a detail that overshadowed every other aspect of their lives. Mark recognized, however, that these details were not the whole of the story. Beyond the rumors, there were people, faces that bore the imprint of generations, voices that carried echoes of both struggle and survival. Some family members displayed behaviors that puzzled visitors, sudden outbursts, fragmented speech, or prolonged silences. To those on the outside, these quirks became proof of the tales told around town. To those within, they were simply part of daily life. Tracing their lineage revealed not scandal but a portrait of endurance. Families in the mountains often relied only on themselves, and in doing so, they forged bonds that could not be easily severed. The Whitakers had become a symbol of that endurance, though one marked by strangeness to the eyes of those who did not share their world. Mark found himself reflecting on how history chooses what to remember. A king's triumph, a nation's fall, a discovery etched in stone. These endure in books. The Whitakers' story, born of isolation and kinship, endured only in whispers, in cautious glances from neighbors, and in the gaze of those who finally met them face to face. Their lineage was not only a tale of blood but a mirror of survival in a place where the mountains kept their people close, and sometimes too close. The turning point in the Whitakers' story came when a small team, led by Mark and accompanied by a local guide, stepped onto their property with cameras. Until then, the family had existed almost like a rumor, known yet unseen. Photographs had circulated before. Grainy images passed quietly among locals, but this time was different. This time the stillness of the hollow would be broken by the whirring of film. At first, the Whitakers seemed uneasy, their eyes narrowing at the sight of strangers carrying equipment. Yet the presence of the guide, someone they recognized from nearby, softened the moment. Introductions were brief, words sparse, but slowly the family allowed the cameras into their lives. For Mark, it was both a privilege and a burden. Every frame captured felt like stepping deeper into a fragile world not meant for the glare of outsiders. The scenes that followed were unlike anything he had ever recorded. One family member barked, instead of speaking, a sound startling in the quiet air, while another rocked gently on the porch, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the tree line. Others muttered brief responses or avoided eye contact altogether. These behaviors, so unusual to outside viewers, became defining images once the footage spread. Yet in person, Mark felt less shock than a strange reverence. Behind each sound, each silence was a story too deep for the camera to capture. The house itself became part of the documentary, its sagging porch, the piles of worn belongings, the air of timelessness that clung to every corner. Each shot held both intimacy and intrusion, as though the lens revealed truths that words could never frame, but also stripped away the protective barrier the Whitakers had built for decades. When the filming ended, Mark knew the story would not remain in the hollow. It would ripple outward, reaching audiences who had never set foot in West Virginia, who would see in the Whitakers either tragedy, curiosity, or endurance. The encounter was no longer private. It was history now, captured in film, framed by outsiders and destined to be debated long after the cameras left the ridge. When the footage of the Whitakers began to circulate, it stirred reactions far beyond the Appalachian hills. Some viewers responded with shock, their fascination laced with discomfort. Others voiced compassion, seeing not a spectacle, but a family, surviving under extraordinary circumstances. The documentary had opened a window into a world that had been closed for decades, and through that window, the world outside peered in, sometimes with empathy, sometimes with cruelty. Debate soon followed. Was this exposure a necessary act of documentation, or an intrusion into lives that had not asked for the spotlight? Scholars of social history argued that the Whitakers represented an important case study of isolation and kinship in rural America, a portrait of endurance on the margins. Critics countered that filming them was exploitative, turning private lives into public entertainment without fully understanding the cost. Mark found himself caught in the middle of this debate. His intention had never been to sensationalize but to document, to capture the humanity within the silence of the Whitakers' world. Yet he could not ignore the way the footage spread across the internet, shared and reshared, sometimes accompanied by mocking commentary, other times framed as a cautionary tale. The family had become both subject and symbol, objects of fascination rather than participants in their own story. Amid the controversy, there were also those who asked what could be done to help. Viewers raised questions about resources, health, care, and community support, wondering whether attention might translate into aid. For others, however, the debate remained academic, an argument over ethics rather than an attempt to engage with the realities of the Whitakers' lives. What lingered most, however, was the unease. The Whitakers had never sought recognition, yet they had become known across the world. Their story was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to the endless debate between exposure exposure and protection, between truth-telling and spectacle. And in that tension, the Whitakers remained, living in their house surrounded by the woods, carrying on much as they always had, while the outside world argued over what their story truly meant. In the years that followed, the Whitakers remained in their home, their routines unchanged, despite the storm of attention beyond the ridge. The outside world moved on, shifting to new stories, but the family endured as they always had, quietly, within the boundaries of their hollow. For Mark, the memories of his time with them lingered like a shadow. He recalled the piercing silences, the sudden barks, the unspoken rhythms of daily life, and realized that what stayed with him most was not the strangeness, but the resilience. The Whitakers had been cast into the world's gaze as symbols of isolation, yet within their silence was dignity. They had survived generations of hardship, carving out a place in the hills where few dared to linger. While outsiders debated, filmed, and speculated, the family simply continued, bound not by the judgment of others, but by ties that stretched back through the decades. Questions still hung over their story. Were the rumors true? Could science and genealogy untangle the complexities of their ancestry? Historians and locals alike continued to argue, but the answers remained elusive. Perhaps that was the essence of the Whitakers' legacy, not certainty, but mystery. They stood as a reminder that history is not only grand battles or celebrated figures, but also the quiet, often uncomfortable realities of families who lived in the margins, unseen until the light found them. Mark understood, too, that their story raised difficult questions about storytelling itself. What does it mean to reveal lives that had long been private? Where is the line between understanding and exploitation? In the end, the Whitakers' tale became a mirror, not only of their world but of ours, reflecting our fascination with what lies hidden and our struggle to face it with empathy rather than scorn. The house still stands, weathered against the winds of time, its porch creaking beneath the weight of footsteps, its windows watching silently, and within, the Whitakers remain, neither myths nor monsters but people, living, enduring, and carrying forward their untold history in the shadows of the past. The story of the Whitakers fades now, like smoke dissolving into night air. The hills of West Virginia grow quiet again, the house retreating into shadow, and the voices you have heard slip back into silence. Their story remains with us, lingering, not in the noise of spectacle, but in the steady rhythm of lives lived away from the world's gaze. So, what are your thoughts about that? Let us know in comment section. Please make sure to like the video and subscribe. We will see you next time.